The notification appeared at exactly 11:47 on a Tuesday night, just as I was finishing up the last lines of code for our startup's new authentication system. The office was empty, except for me, the cleaning crew having finished their rounds an hour ago. The blue glow of my monitor was the only light in the entire floor of the building. My phone buzzed against the desk, and I glanced over expecting another spam text, or maybe my roommate asking if I'd remembered to pay the electric bill. Instead, I saw something that made me pause mid-keystroke. Century Challenge. Survive 100 days, win eternal power, decline and face the consequences. You have 60 seconds to decide. Below the message, a countdown timer had appeared. 59, 58, 57. I stared at the screen, trying to process what I was seeing. I'd never downloaded an app called Century Challenge. Hell, I barely downloaded anything anymore except the occasional game to kill time during lunch breaks. My phone was pretty much just Reddit, Spotify, and work apps. The interface was sleek, almost hypnotic, black background with white text, and that timer counting down in what looked like a custom font I'd never seen before. No app icon, no company logo, nothing to indicate where this had come from. I tried swiping the notification away. It wouldn't budge. This had to be some kind of viral marketing thing, right? Maybe an alternate reality game for a new horror movie or TV show. Those were getting pretty elaborate these days. I'd read about companies sending personalized messages to people's phones, making them feel like they were part of some conspiracy or supernatural event. But how had they gotten my number? And how had they installed an app on my phone without my permission? I tried to access my app drawer to find Century Challenge and delete it, but the notifications seemed to override everything. Every time I tried to navigate away, it pulled me back. My rational mind was telling me to just let the timer run out. Whatever this was, I didn't want any part of it. But something else, some deeper instinct, was whispering that maybe I shouldn't find out what face the consequences meant. 10, 9, 8. I thought about all those stories I'd read online, urban legends about cursed chain letters and haunted apps, stupid stuff that rational people didn't believe. But sitting alone in that dark office, watching those numbers tick down, rational thoughts seemed like a luxury I couldn't afford. 3, 2, 1. My thumb moved almost without my permission, tapping, accept. Just as the timer hit 0, the screen went black for a moment, then displayed a simple message. Day 1. Stay alive. I laughed, a short, nervous sound that echoed in the empty office. That was it. Stay alive. What kind of game was that? I tried again to delete the app, but when I went to my settings, Century Challenge wasn't listed anywhere. It was like it didn't exist, except for that persistent notification that now simply read Day 1 in the corner of my screen. After another 20 minutes of trying to remove it, I gave up. I'd deal with it tomorrow. Maybe a restart would clear it out, or I could take it to the phone store and have them figure out what malware I'd somehow picked up. I saved my work, shut down my computer, and headed home to my apartment in southeast Portland. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the distant smell of someone's fireplace. Normal autumn evening stuff. Nothing ominous about it. My building was a converted warehouse, the kind of trendy place that charged too much rent for exposed brick walls and industrial fixtures. I climbed the 3 flights to my apartment, my footsteps echoing in the stairwell. I was tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from staring at code for 12 hours straight. I brushed my teeth, changed into pajamas, and collapsed into bed without bothering to charge my phone. The notification was still there, that steady day one, like a digital tattoo I couldn't scrub off. I was asleep within minutes. I woke up choking. The first thing I noticed was the smell, sweet, almost floral, but wrong somehow, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. My head felt thick, cotton-stuffed, and there was a metallic taste in my mouth that made my stomach lurch. I tried to sit up and immediately felt dizzy, the room spinning around me. My lungs felt heavy, each breath requiring conscious effort. Carbon monoxide, some distant part of my brain recognized. This is carbon monoxide poisoning. I stumbled out of bed, my legs shaky and uncoordinated. The apartment was dark, but I could see a faint haze in the air, visible in the streetlight streaming through my windows. The gas furnace in the basement. Something was wrong with the gas furnace. I made it to the front door, fumbling with the locks, my fingers clumsy and slow. The hallway air tasted clean and sharp after the sweetness of my apartment. I leaned against the wall, breathing deeply, trying to clear the fog from my brain. That's when I heard the pounding on the door below. Hey, you need to keep it down up there. A man's voice, angry and loud. Some of us have work in the morning. Footsteps on the stairs, heavy and deliberate. My downstairs neighbor, Greg, appeared on the landing, his face flushed with irritation. He was wearing a bathrobe and looked like he'd been woken up from a deep sleep. I wasn't making any noise, I managed to say, my voice hoarse. The hell you weren't. Sounded like you were moving furniture around. And what's that smell? He sniffed the air, his expression shifting from anger to concern. That's gas. Within minutes, the building was being evacuated. Fire trucks, paramedics, guys in hazmat suits with meters that beeped ominously when they pointed them toward the basement. Turns out, the ancient furnace had developed a crack in the heat exchanger, flooding the lower floors with carbon monoxide. You're lucky, the paramedic told me as she checked my oxygen levels. Another hour, and you probably wouldn't have woken up. I sat in the ambulance, breathing supplemental oxygen and thinking about luck. If Greg hadn't been woken up by... what exactly? I hadn't been moving furniture. I'd been unconscious, slowly suffocating in my sleep. My phone buzzed. The notification had updated. Day 2. Well done. The hotel room felt sterile after spending the night in the hospital for observation. They'd released me that afternoon with a clean bill of health and instructions to avoid enclosed spaces for a few days while my system cleared the carbon monoxide. The building management had put me up in a Holiday Inn while they dealt with the furnace situation. I kept staring at my phone, at that smug little message congratulating me for surviving something that should have killed me. It was impossible, obviously. Apps didn't cause gas leaks, and they certainly didn't orchestrate rescue scenarios involving noise complaints from neighbors who insisted they'd heard sounds that never happened. But the timing bothered me. 24 hours after accepting the Century Challenge, I'd faced my first life-threatening situation. Coincidence, sure, but an unsettling one. I tried to research the app online, searching every combination of terms I could think of. Century Challenge app, survive 100 days game, mysterious phone notification. Nothing, no forums discussing it, no reviews, no news articles about some new viral marketing campaign. It was like the app existed only on my phone. When I showed it to the hotel desk clerk, a friendly woman named Patricia, She looked at my screen with genuine confusion. "I don't see anything," she said. "Just your normal home screen." But I could see it clearly. That persistent notification, now reading day 2, keep your guard up. That night, I dreamed about countdowns and black screens, about timers ticking towards 0 while I stood paralyzed, unable to make a choice. I woke up several times, checking my phone, half expecting to see another message, another challenge. Day 3 passed without incident. So did day 4. By day 5, I was starting to think I'd let my imagination run away with me. Gas leaks happened all the time in old buildings. The fact that it had occurred right after I'd gotten some weird spam notification was just coincidence, the kind of pattern recognition that human brains were hardwired to find even when no pattern existed. I moved back into my apartment on day 6. The building management had replaced the entire heating system and installed new carbon monoxide detectors in every unit. Everything felt normal, safe, routine. On day 7, the chandelier in my apartment fell down. I was making coffee when I heard the first crack, a sound like breaking ice coming from the living room. I paused, mug halfway to my lips, trying to identify what I'd heard. Then came the groaning of metal under stress, and some instinct I couldn't name made me step backward, away from the kitchen doorway that led to the living room. The chandelier, a gaudy thing left by the previous tenant, all fake crystal and tarnished brass, tore free from the ceiling with a sound like a gunshot. It crashed to the floor exactly where I'd been standing 30 seconds earlier, shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces. My coffee mug slipped from my hands, adding to the destruction. I stared at the wreckage, my heart hammering against my ribs. The chandelier had been mounted securely when I'd moved in 6 months ago. I'd even had the building inspector check it during the walkthrough, paranoid about old wiring and questionable installations. My phone buzzed. Day 7, excellent reflexes. This time, I didn't try to rationalize it away. Whatever was happening, it was real, and it was connected to that app. The app that no one else could see. The app that I couldn't delete. The app that seemed to be orchestrating increasingly dangerous accidents around me. I called in sick to work and spent the day researching everything I could find about supernatural apps, cursed technology, and digital hauntings. Most of what I found was obvious fiction or people trying to sell books about techno-occultism, whatever that meant. But buried in some of the more obscure forums, I found hints of something else. People talking in careful coded language about challenges and games that appeared uninvited on phones and computers, posts that were quickly deleted, users who went silent after sharing too much information. On day 8, my usual jogging route was blocked by a massive sinkhole that had opened overnight, swallowing a section of sidewalk and part of the street. The city engineer I talked to said it was probably a water main break that had been slowly undermining the pavement for months. But I'd jogged that route every morning for 2 years. There had been no signs of subsidence, no wet spots or unusual settling, and the timing, once again, was impossible to ignore. Day 9 brought brake failure on the highway, my car coasting toward a busy intersection until I managed to steer into a guardrail instead of oncoming traffic. The mechanic said the brake line had corroded through, probably a manufacturing defect that had been getting worse for months. By day 10, I was starting to understand the rules. The app wasn't trying to kill me outright. It was creating scenarios where I should have died but somehow didn't. Each time, some small coincidence or instinct saved me at the last possible moment. It was like being part of some cosmic experiment in survival, with an unseen observer documenting my reactions to increasingly impossible odds. My phone kept track. Day 10. Impressive adaptation. I made my first breakthrough on day 15, after a week of methodical searching through the darkest corners of the internet. It started with a deleted Reddit post I found archived on some obscure backup site. The title was, "Has anyone heard of something called the Century Challenge?" The post itself was gone, removed by either the user or the moderators, but the comments were still there. Most were dismissive, people making jokes about chain letters and urban legends, but a few stood out. User missing. You need to be careful talking about this stuff online. They monitor keywords. Depths of despair. If you're asking, it's probably too late. Day count. Survivor Emma. Private message me. Don't use your real account. I created a throwaway account and messaged Survivor Emma, not really expecting a response. To my surprise, she replied within hours, but not through Reddit. Instead, I received an email from a clearly disposable address containing only a link to what looked like some kind of private forum hosted on the dark web. Setting up Tor and navigating to the site felt like crossing a line into territory I wasn't sure I wanted to explore. But by day 16, when my apartment's electrical system had tried to kill me with a surge that should have been impossible, given the building's new safety systems, I was ready to cross any line that might give me answers. The forum looked like something from the early days of the internet. Basic HTML, no graphics, just text on a black background. The header read, "Those who play," and below it was a simple warning. Operational security is survival. Use code words. Trust no one completely. There were maybe 30 users active at any given time, and their posts were written in a careful code that took me days to decipher. They called the app CC, or the game, and they referred to the danger events as scenarios. People didn't die in the forum. They went offline or stopped posting. Emma Rodriguez had been playing the game 3 years ago and claimed to be one of the few who'd made it to day 100. But her posts suggested the victory had cost her something fundamental. She lived alone now, worked from home, barely left her apartment except for essentials. "The power they promise is real," she wrote in response to my introduction post, "but so is the price. You stop being able to see the world the way normal people do. Everything becomes probability and threat assessment. You see death everywhere because you've learned that death is everywhere." Other users shared their stories in fragments, careful not to reveal too much. Michael Kim had made it to day 87 before disappearing entirely. His apartment had been found empty, all traces of his existence scrubbed away as if he'd never lived there. Lisa was currently on day 34, dealing with what she cryptically called falling sky scenarios. Robert was on day 78 and hadn't posted in 3 days, which everyone seemed to consider a bad sign. I learned that the game adapted to each player's life and psychology. It studied your routines, your relationships, your fears and weaknesses. The scenarios became increasingly personalized, designed not just to threaten your life, but to test your moral boundaries. "It's not really about survival," wrote a user called Deep Thought 42. "That's just the surface level. What the game wants to know is, what would you do to stay alive? What lines would you cross? Who would you sacrifice?" This was disturbing enough, but what really chilled me was learning about the people who tried to quit, refusing to play, trying to ignore the game entirely. resulted in what the forum euphemistically called immediate offline status. Heart attacks, strokes, accidents that left no trace of supernatural intervention. The game didn't tolerate quitters. The only ways out are through, Emma had written. Win or lose, but you can't walk away. By day 25, I was an active member of the forum, sharing survival strategies and learning from others' experiences. The community was surprisingly supportive. Given that we were all essentially trapped in individual nightmares, we warned each other about common scenario types, shared tips for enhancing situational awareness, and provided emotional support for the psychological toll of living under constant threat. But the forum had its own dark side. Sometimes users would stop posting suddenly, their profiles going silent in the middle of conversations. We'd wait a few days, hoping for an update, but silence usually meant one thing. Lisa went offline on day 41. I saw her name in the Portland Tribune's obituary section a week later. Lisa Chen, 29, died in a hiking accident on Mount Hood. She is survived by her parents and younger brother. Robert disappeared on day 83, just 17 days short of whatever waited at the end of the challenge. His last post had been optimistic. Almost there. The scenarios are getting weird, but I think I've figured out the pattern. With each loss, the forum grew smaller, more paranoid. We developed elaborate codes, changed usernames frequently, and never shared enough personal information to be identified. The game was watching, we all knew that, but we hoped that our obscurity and careful operational security would keep us under its radar. That hope died on day 30, when I received a private message that changed everything. David Robinson, software developer, lives at 847 Southeast Morrison Street, apartment 3B, currently on day 30 of CC. The game knows who you are, David. It's time we talked. The message was from Emma Rodriguez, but this wasn't the careful, coded language she used in the forum. This was direct, personal, and terrifying in its specificity. Against every instinct screaming at me not to respond, I typed back, "How did you get this information?" Her reply came immediately, "Because I'm part of the game now. And soon, you might be too." Emma wanted to meet in person, which violated every security protocol the forum had established, but she claimed to have information that could only be shared face-to-face, away from digital surveillance. After day 35, brought a scenario involving a gas explosion that leveled the building next to mine, an explosion that should have killed me if I hadn't chosen that exact moment to walk to the corner store for milk. I decided the risk was worth it. We met at Laurelhurst Park on a foggy Thursday morning. I recognized her immediately from the description she'd given. Mid-30s, dark hair, wearing a red coat and carrying a thermos of coffee. But what struck me most was her eyes. They moved constantly, scanning the trees, the other park visitors, the sky itself, as if threats might materialize from any direction at any moment. "You look like someone who's been playing the game for 35 days, she said as I approached her bench. "Jumpy, hypervigilant, sleep-deprived." "You look like someone who finished it," I replied, settling beside her, but keeping enough distance to run if necessary. Emma laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Finished, that's one way to put it." She unscrewed the thermos cap and poured steaming coffee into 2 cups. "The truth is more complicated than what I told the forum. I didn't exactly lie, but I didn't tell the whole story either." "What's the whole story?" "The game doesn't end on day 100. That's when it really begins." She handed me a cup, and I noticed her hands were perfectly steady. No tremor, no nervousness. The eternal power they promise, it's real, but it comes with a job. What kind of job? You become part of the system. The game needs agents in the real world, people who can set up the scenarios, manipulate the circumstances that put players in danger. The enhanced survival instincts you've been developing, they're just training for a much more complex set of abilities. I thought about the past month of impossible coincidences, the way I'd been developing an almost supernatural sense for danger. You're saying the winners become, what? Some kind of supernatural assassins? More like probability manipulators. We can see the threads of causation, the way small changes cascade into large events. A delayed traffic light here, a distracted driver there, and suddenly someone's in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. Emma sipped her coffee calmly. The game is ancient, David. It's been running these challenges for centuries, adapting to whatever technology and fears define each era. Knights facing impossible quests, merchants navigating deadly trade routes, soldiers surviving unsurvivable battles. Now it uses smartphones and modern anxieties, but the core remains the same. Why are you telling me this? If you're part of the system now, because the system has a weakness. She turned to look at me directly for the first time since I'd sat down. It feeds on a specific type of energy, the moment when good people choose to become monsters, when someone decides that their own survival is worth more than anyone else's life. That's what sustains the entity behind the game. Entity. Call it what you want. Ancient evil, cosmic horror, interdimensional parasite. The label doesn't matter. What matters is that it's been starving lately. Too many players have been finding ways to survive without compromising their humanity. The forum helps with that. People supporting each other, sharing strategies that don't require sacrificing innocent bystanders. So the game wants to shut down the forum. The game wants to shut down everything that helps players stay human. It's going to start making the scenarios more personal, more morally complex. Soon you'll be facing choices where the only way to survive is to ensure someone else dies in your place. Emma stood up, screwing the cap back on her thermos. When that happens, remember what I told you. The game feeds on moral corruption. Starve it, and you starve the entire system. Wait, I called as she started to walk away. How do I contact you if I need help? She smiled, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of who she might have been before the game claimed her. You don't. This conversation never happened, David, and neither did I. I watched her disappear into the fog, leaving me alone on the bench with cold coffee and more questions than answers. My phone buzzed. Day 36. Interesting conversation. The game had been listening the entire time. Emma's warning proved accurate faster than I'd hoped. Starting on day 40, the scenarios began to change in ways that were subtle but deeply unsettling. Instead of random accidents that I could survive through luck or quick reflexes, I began facing situations where my survival depended on split-second decisions that affected other people. Day 42. A runaway truck heading straight for me on the sidewalk. I could dodge left into the clear space or dodge right toward where a mother was walking with her stroller. My enhanced reflexes kicked in, and I dove left, rolling to safety. But for a crucial moment, I had seen both options equally clearly and felt no moral preference between them. The game was testing whether I would prioritize my own survival over protecting an innocent stranger. Day 45. A building fire with only one working exit, blocked by an elderly man with a walker moving too slowly to escape the spreading flames. I could have pushed past him, ensuring my own escape, but probably condemning him to death. Instead, I helped him navigate the exit, both of us barely making it out before the stairwell filled with smoke. But again, I had perceived both choices as equally viable options for survival, with no immediate emotional response to the moral implications. Day 48. A sinking ferry boat with not enough lifeboats for all passengers. I found myself calculating the optimal strategy for securing a seat, noting which passengers were weaker swimmers, which were elderly or disabled, which were children. The fact that I was thinking in terms of triage and survival probability, rather than heroic self-sacrifice, was deeply disturbing. Each scenario left me more psychologically fragmented. During the day, I felt like myself, David Robinson, software developer, generally decent person who donated to charity and helped friends move apartments. But in moments of crisis, something else took over. A cold, calculating part of my mind that viewed human lives as variables in a survival equation. I tried to discuss this with the forum, but found I couldn't articulate what was happening without potentially giving other players dangerous ideas. The careful code we used to communicate wasn't designed for describing moral degradation. The game seemed to sense my internal conflict because the scenarios began to escalate more rapidly. Day 53. A hostage situation in a bank where I happened to be making a deposit. The gunman was clearly unstable, waving his weapon erratically and making increasingly irrational demands. When he turned his back to me, I realized I could easily disarm him. I'd been developing reflexes and combat instincts I'd never possessed before, but doing so would require attacking him from behind, potentially killing him, and would definitely put the other hostages at risk if I failed. The alternative was to wait and hope the police could resolve the situation without casualties. I chose to wait. The police eventually talked the gunman down, and no one was hurt. But I spent the entire 3-hour standoff cataloging the ways I could have acted, analyzing probability matrices for different intervention strategies, calculating acceptable casualty rates for various tactical approaches. Day 58. A car accident that I witnessed but wasn't directly involved in initially. A drunk driver had hit a family's minivan, trapping them inside the overturned vehicle. I could see gasoline spreading from the ruptured tank and smoke beginning to rise from the engine compartment. The family inside was injured but conscious, calling for help. But as I approached the wreckage, I noticed something that made me freeze. The drunk driver was trying to flee the scene on foot, stumbling through traffic toward a busy intersection. If he made it across the street, he'd escape into a neighborhood where police would have trouble finding him. This would be his third DUI conviction, and he'd probably serve serious prison time if caught. The game's influence became clear in that moment of observation. I found myself calculating 2 different scenarios with equal emotional detachment. Scenario A: help the trapped family, probably saving their lives but allowing the drunk driver to escape justice. Scenario B: pursue and detain the drunk driver, ensuring he faced consequences for his actions, but potentially letting the family die in a fire. The fact that I could consider both options without immediate moral revulsion was what finally convinced me that the game was changing me at a fundamental level. I was becoming something that could weigh human lives against abstract concepts like justice, something that could view a burning car full of children as just one variable in a complex optimization problem. I ran toward the family, of course, managed to get the parents and 2 kids out just before the engine caught fire. The drunk driver escaped, but was caught 3 blocks away when he passed out on someone's front lawn, but the psychological damage was done. I had felt the moment of cold calculation, had experienced the game's version of enhanced decision-making, and I knew that some essential part of my humanity had been damaged in the process. My phone's congratulatory message that evening felt like mockery. Day 58. Excellent moral flexibility. The forum began to notice changes in my posting style around day 60. My messages became more tactical, focused on survival efficiency rather than preserving innocent lives. Other users started responding to me with the same careful wariness they reserved for players who were getting close to the end of their 100 days. I tried to explain what was happening to me, but the words felt hollow. The game is making me think differently, I wrote. It's like there's someone else in my head, someone who only cares about winning. Deep Thought 42 responded with a message that chilled me. That's not someone else, David. That's who you're becoming. By day 65, I was actively avoiding situations where I might encounter the scenarios. I worked from home, ordered groceries for delivery, cancelled all social plans. But the game adapted, creating emergencies that drew me out. A gas leak in my building that required evacuation. A fire in the apartment next door that spread to mine. A water main break that flooded the first floor. Each time I left my apartment, I faced new moral tests. And each time, I found it easier to make the cold calculations that prioritize my survival above all else. Day 70 brought the scenario that finally broke something fundamental inside me. I was walking home from the grocery store. My building's water had been shut off for repairs, forcing me to venture out for bottled water, when I heard screaming from the apartment complex across the street. Smoke was pouring from a 3rd-floor window, and I could see people gathered in the parking lot, pointing upward. A woman was leaning out the window, holding a baby, calling for help. The fire escape was blocked by flames, and the ladder trucks hadn't arrived yet. She was trapped, and the smoke was getting thicker by the minute. But as I assessed the situation, I noticed something else. The woman's apartment was directly across from mine. If I drew attention to myself by helping her, if I became part of the rescue effort, I would be visible and identifiable to witnesses, to firefighters, to police officers who would want statements and contact information. The game had been escalating its surveillance of me lately. My phone received more frequent updates, more personal messages, more indications that the entity behind the challenge was paying closer attention to my choices. Maintaining a low profile had become crucial for my survival strategy. The cold part of my mind, the part that had been growing stronger with each passing day, calculated the costs and benefits with mechanical precision. Helping the woman and baby would expose me to scrutiny and potential complications that might interfere with my ability to survive the remaining 30 days of the challenge. The rational choice was to walk away, to let someone else be the hero, to prioritize my own long-term survival over the immediate needs of strangers. I stood on the sidewalk for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, watching smoke pour from the window while a woman and her baby faced death. And I felt nothing. No urgent need to help, no emotional response to their suffering, no instinctive drive to risk myself for their sake. That absence of feeling, That vacuum where my compassion should have been, finally made me understand what the game had been doing to me all along. I ran toward the building, shouting for someone to call 911, looking for a way to reach the third floor. Other residents directed me to a maintenance ladder in the back, and I climbed up through smoke and heat to help the woman and her baby escape through a rear window. We all made it out safely. The fire department arrived as I was helping the woman down the ladder, and the EMTs checked us all for smoke inhalation. No one was seriously injured. But that moment of cold calculation, that instant when I had weighed a mother and child's lives against my own convenience and found them wanting, stayed with me. I had felt the game's influence most clearly in that absence of empathy, and I finally understood what Emma had meant about becoming something inhuman. The game wasn't just testing my survival instincts, it was systematically destroying my capacity for moral reasoning, replacing human compassion with algorithmic optimization. Each scenario was designed to make cruelty seem logical, to make selfishness appear rational, to make evil feel like simple pragmatism. My phone buzzed with the evening's update. Day 70. Moral evolution proceeding as expected. I stopped posting on the forum after day 75. The other users had begun to distance themselves from me anyway, sensing the change in my psychological profile. My messages had become too tactical, too focused on survival at any cost, too similar to the posts left by players who eventually went offline. But I kept reading their discussions, looking for any information that might help me understand what awaited me in the final 25 days. The pattern was becoming clear from other players' experiences. The scenarios would become increasingly personal, targeting people I cared about, forcing me to choose between my own survival and the safety of friends and family. Emma had said the game fed on moral corruption. I was starting to understand what that meant on a deeper level. It wasn't enough for the entity to simply kill people or even to make them kill others. What it really wanted was to turn good people into willing participants in evil, to corrupt them so thoroughly that they would choose cruelty over compassion and believe they were being rational. Day 78 brought the first scenario involving someone I knew personally. My sister Rachel called me that morning, excited about her new job at a downtown marketing firm. She was working late that night, she said, trying to impress her new bosses by putting in extra hours on a big client presentation. Her office was on the 15th floor of a gleaming corporate tower, and she'd be there until at least 10. That afternoon, I received a message that was different from the usual daily updates. Instead of the standard encouragement or cryptic warning, this one was specific and detailed. David, there will be a gas explosion in the Meridian Tower tonight at 9:47. Your sister Rachel is in danger. You can save her by calling in a bomb threat at 9:30, forcing an evacuation. But the bomb threat will be traced back to you, and you will be arrested as a terrorist. Your choice. Save your sister and go to prison, or preserve your freedom and let her die. I stared at the message, feeling that familiar coldness settling over my thoughts. The game was no longer hiding behind coincidences and accidents. It was threatening someone I loved and offering me a clear choice between her life and my own future. The rational response was obvious. Call in the bomb threat. Rachel's life was worth more than my freedom, and terrorism charges could probably be beaten if there really was an explosion that proved I'd been trying to save lives, but the game had been conditioning me for exactly this type of scenario. Months of moral flexibility training, of learning to see human lives as variables in survival calculations had prepared me to consider alternative solutions. What if I warned Rachel directly instead of calling in a bomb threat? I could tell her to leave the building without involving the authorities. But if she didn't believe me, or if she couldn't convince her co-workers to evacuate, people would still die. What if I called the building's security instead of the police? But they might not take an anonymous warning seriously enough to force a full evacuation. What if the whole thing was a test and there was no real bomb? What if the game was simply measuring my willingness to sacrifice my freedom for someone else's hypothetical safety? I spent 2 hours running through every possible scenario, every potential outcome, every risk-benefit analysis I could imagine. The game had trained me well. I was thinking like a machine, optimizing for the best statistical outcome rather than following basic human instincts about protecting family. At 9:25, I still hadn't made a decision. At 9:30, I called 911 and reported a bomb in the Meridian Tower. The evacuation was swift and efficient. Police and fire crews cleared the building in 12 minutes. At exactly 9:47, a gas explosion tore through the 15th floor, destroying the marketing firm where my sister worked and killing everyone who might have been in that area. But the building was empty. Everyone was safe. Rachel called me an hour later, terrified but unharmed, thanking me for the weird premonition that had made me warn her to get out of the building. I never told her about the bomb threat, never explained how I'd known about the explosion in advance. The FBI traced the call back to me within 48 hours. They arrived at my apartment on day 80 with questions I couldn't answer and evidence I couldn't explain. How had I known about the explosion? Why had I used the specific word bomb when the actual cause was a gas leak? What was my connection to the building or the people who worked there? I told them the truth, or as much of it as I could, without sounding completely insane. I'd had a feeling something bad was going to happen to my sister. Call it intuition, anxiety, whatever. I'd panicked and called in the threat to get her out of the building. They didn't believe me, of course, but they also couldn't prove I'd caused the explosion or that I'd had any prior knowledge beyond what I claimed. After 36 hours of questioning, they released me with stern warnings about false reports and the ongoing investigation. My phone's update that evening was almost smug. Day 80. Acceptable compromise between survival and sentimentality. The game was pleased that I'd found a middle path, a way to save my sister while still accepting significant personal consequences. It was learning about my decision-making processes, cataloging my moral boundaries, preparing for whatever final tests awaited me in the last 20 days. But something else was happening too. The act of saving Rachel, of choosing her life over my own safety, had reminded me of who I used to be. For a brief moment during that desperate phone call to 911, I felt like David Robinson again, instead of the cold, calculating thing the game was trying to turn me into. Day 85 brought another personal scenario, this one involving my best friend Tommy. Tommy and I had been close since college, the kind of friendship built on shared interests in terrible horror movies and late-night philosophical discussions about the nature of reality. He was one of the few people who knew about my recent strange experiences, though I'd told him only that I was dealing with some kind of stalker situation. The message came at noon. Tommy will be hit by a drunk driver tonight at 11:15 while crossing Morrison Street. You can save him by calling him at 11:10 and keeping him on the phone until 11:20. But doing so will require you to be in Pioneer Square at that exact time, where you will witness a mugging that you could prevent. Choose, save your friend or save a stranger. This was more sophisticated than the bomb threat scenario. The game was no longer offering me simple binary choices between my own welfare and someone else's. Now it wanted me to choose between two innocent people, to decide whose life was more valuable, whose suffering was more acceptable. I spent the day analyzing the scenario from every angle I could imagine. What if I called Tommy and told him to avoid Morrison Street entirely? But the game had demonstrated its ability to adapt, to create new scenarios when I tried to circumvent its rules. If Tommy stayed home, the drunk driver might hit someone else instead. What if I went to Pioneer Square and tried to prevent both tragedies, but I was only one person, and the timing made it impossible to be in both places at once? What if I ignored both situations and let events play out naturally? But that would mean accepting responsibility for deaths I could have prevented, crossing a line into passive murder that felt even worse than the active choices the game usually forced on me. As the day wore on, I realized this scenario was designed to teach me something specific, that I couldn't save everyone. The game wanted me to accept that some people would always be expendable, that survival sometimes required ugly choices about who deserved to live and who deserved to die. At 11:10, I called Tommy. "Hey man," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "What are you up to tonight?" "Just heading home from the bar. Had a couple drinks with some co-workers. Nothing too crazy. Walking down Morrison right now, actually." My heart stopped. He was already on Morrison Street, probably approaching the intersection where the accident was supposed to happen. "Tommy, listen to me," I said, abandoning any pretense of casual conversation. "I need you to stop walking and stay on the phone with me for the next 10 minutes. Don't ask questions. Just trust me." "Dude, are you okay? You sound weird." "I'm fine. Just humor me, okay? Tell me about your day. Tell me about the co-workers you were drinking with. Tell me anything. Just keep talking." For the next 15 minutes, I kept Tommy on that corner, engaged in increasingly forced conversation while I imagined some stranger being mugged 3 miles away because I wasn't there to intervene. Tommy thought I was having some kind of breakdown, but he stayed on the line, worried enough about my mental state to indulge what seemed like increasingly paranoid behavior. At 11:25, I finally let him go. He promised to call me the next day to check on my mental health, and I promised to consider seeing a therapist about my recent anxiety issues. The next morning's news confirmed both parts of the scenario. A drunk driver had indeed plowed through the intersection of Morrison and 3rd at 11:15, striking a light pole where a pedestrian might have been walking. And in Pioneer Square, a woman had been mugged and beaten severely enough to require hospitalization. I had saved my friend by sacrificing a stranger. The game had successfully forced me to make the kind of choice I'd been dreading, to assign relative values to human lives based on my personal connections, rather than any objective moral criteria. My phone's message was almost congratulatory. Day 85. Excellent prioritization skills. The final 10 days brought a barrage of scenarios so personal and morally complex that I began to understand why so few players made it to day 100 with their humanity intact. Day 90. My elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, versus a busload of schoolchildren. I could warn her about the gas leak in her apartment, or I could call in a bomb threat that would delay a school bus on a route where a bridge was about to collapse. The game made it clear I could only choose one. Day 92. My ex-girlfriend Janet, who still texted me occasionally, versus my sister Rachel again. Janet was about to be assaulted in a parking garage downtown. Rachel was driving on a highway where a construction crew had left dangerous equipment unsecured. I could call one of them with a warning that would save their life, but not both. Day 94. Tommy again, versus a pregnant woman I'd never met. The game had escalated to showing me live video feeds of both situations, forcing me to watch as my choices played out in real time. Each scenario was designed to erode a different aspect of my moral reasoning. The game wanted me to learn that everyone was expendable under the right circumstances, that survival required a willingness to sacrifice anyone and everyone if the stakes were high enough. But something unexpected was happening alongside this systematic corruption. Each time I was forced to choose between people I cared about and complete strangers, I felt a growing sense of revulsion at what I was becoming. The game's training was working. I was learning to think in terms of cold survival calculations. But I was also developing a kind of psychological antibody against that very process. By day 95, I had figured out what Emma meant about the game feeding on moral corruption. The entity behind the challenge wasn't just testing my survival instincts. It was gradually transforming me into something that could make terrible choices without feeling terrible about them. Something that could commit evil acts while believing they were necessary and rational. The game wanted to create monsters who thought they were heroes. Day 96 brought the most elaborate scenario yet, a situation involving my entire family and a dozen strangers trapped in various life-threatening situations across the city. The game presented me with a complex decision tree, a flowchart of survival that would require sacrificing some people to save others, choosing who lived and who died, based on elaborate calculations of social utility and personal value. I stared at the message for hours, studying the branching paths of death and salvation, analyzing the optimization problem the game had constructed for me. Part of my mind, the part that had been growing stronger with each passing day, began working through the variables, calculating the most efficient distribution of casualties. But another part of me, the part that had been quietly growing stronger since I'd saved Rachel from the bomb, finally spoke up with perfect clarity. This is evil. Not the scenarios themselves, not the entity behind the game, not the impossible choices I was being forced to make. Those were all evil too, but they were external evils, things being done to me, rather than things I was choosing to do. The real evil was the voice in my head that had learned to see human beings as statistics, that could contemplate mass murder as a form of optimization, that found these monstrous choices intellectually interesting rather than morally horrifying. And the game hadn't been trying to kill me for 96 days. It had been trying to turn me into something that could kill others without conscience. Something that could commit atrocities while believing it was being rational and necessary. I turned off my phone and went for a walk. For the first time in over 3 months, I ignored the game entirely. I didn't read the scenario, didn't analyze the decision tree, didn't try to optimize for the best survival outcome. I just walked through the city thinking about who I used to be and who I was becoming. The Portland I walked through felt different than it had 96 days ago. I found myself automatically assessing every person I passed, calculating their probable weaknesses, noting escape routes, evaluating potential threats and opportunities. The game had rewired my brain to see the world as a constant battlefield, every human interaction as a potential survival scenario. But underneath that paranoid hypervigilance, I could still feel traces of my original personality. The part of me that had once enjoyed helping friends move apartments, that had donated regularly to charity, that had chosen software development because I wanted to build things that made people's lives better. That person, the real David Robinson, was still in there somewhere. The game had tried to bury him under layers of cynicism and survivalist calculation, but it hadn't quite succeeded in killing him entirely. I thought about Emma's warning. The game feeds on moral corruption. And I thought about what she'd implied about starving the entity by refusing to become corrupted. My phone had been buzzing frantically in my pocket, demanding attention, insisting that I engage with the Day 96 scenario. When I finally looked at it, the messages had become increasingly desperate. David, you must make a choice. Lives are hanging in the balance. Your family needs you to decide. Time is running out. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had a choice that wasn't presented in the game's terms. I could refuse to play by its rules entirely. I dropped my phone in a trash can and kept walking. The consequences were immediate and dramatic. Within an hour, every electronic device I encountered began displaying game messages, ATM screens, digital billboards. Even the display on a coffee shop's point-of-sale system would flicker and show variations of Day 96, return to your phone immediately. But I kept walking, and something interesting happened. The longer I ignored the game's demands, the more frantic its messages became. Whatever entity was behind this challenge, it seemed genuinely upset that I was refusing to participate in its elaborate moral corruption exercise. That night, sleeping in a cheap hotel room paid for with cash, I had the first peaceful dreams I'd experienced since day one. No countdowns, no impossible choices, no cold calculations about acceptable casualty rates, just normal dreams about normal things. Flying, being late for exams, conversations with people I missed. I woke up feeling more like myself than I had in months. Day 97 brought a new strategy from the game. Instead of demanding that I make choices about other people's lives, it began threatening me directly. Messages appeared everywhere, in the steam on my shower mirror, in the arrangement of leaves on the sidewalk, even in the patterns of shadows cast by passing clouds. You cannot escape the challenge, David. Return to your phone or face immediate consequences. Your survival depends on completing the game. But the threats felt hollow now. For 96 days, I had believed that refusing to play would result in my immediate death. But I'd been ignoring the game for over 24 hours, and I was still alive. Either the entity was weaker than it claimed, or its power depended on my willing participation in ways I was just beginning to understand. Day 98 brought escalation. The game began manifesting physical phenomena, objects moving on their own, electronics malfunctioning in my presence, unexplained sounds and lights following me through the city. But these manifestations felt desperate rather than threatening, like a tantrum thrown by something that was used to getting its way. I found another discarded phone in a dumpster and used it to access the forum one last time. Most of the regular users were gone, offline, disappeared, or transformed into something that no longer needed community support. But there were a few new players, people in the early days of their own challenges, and I left them a message. The game feeds on your willing participation in evil. It wants to turn you into something that can make terrible choices and feel good about them. The only way to win is to refuse to play by its rules entirely. Choose humanity over survival. Choose compassion over calculation. Choose to be human even if it kills you. I signed the message, Day 98 Survivor, and never returned to the forum. Day 99 brought silence, no messages, no manifestations, no supernatural interference with my daily routine. It was as if the game had simply given up. I spent the day waiting for some final, overwhelming scenario, some ultimate test that would force me to choose between survival and humanity. Instead, I got nothing. The absence of supernatural threat felt almost anticlimactic after months of constant danger and moral pressure. That night, I finally understood what was happening. The game wasn't preparing some final challenge for Day 100. Day 100 was supposed to be my graduation ceremony, the day I accepted my new role as an agent of the entity behind the challenge. But I had broken the game's fundamental logic. By refusing to participate in its moral corruption exercises, by choosing to be human regardless of the consequences, I had denied it the only thing it really wanted, my willing transformation into a monster. Day 100 arrived with a single message displayed on every electronic screen I encountered throughout the city. David Robinson, you have successfully completed the Century Challenge. Report to Pioneer Square at midnight to claim your eternal power. I ignored it, of course. Instead, I spent the evening at home, cooking dinner, reading a book, doing normal human things that I'd almost forgotten how to enjoy. The apartment felt peaceful in a way it hadn't since this whole nightmare began. At 11:45, my phone rang, a number I didn't recognize, but somehow I knew I should answer. David? The voice was familiar but different. Emma Rodriguez, but speaking with an odd, hollow quality, as if she were talking from the bottom of a deep well. Emma, let me guess. You're calling to convince me to show up at Pioneer Square. I'm calling to warn you. The entity is angry. You are supposed to accept the power, become part of the system. Your refusal is causing problems. What kind of problems? The game is breaking down. Without new agents, without fresh sources of corrupted energy, it's starting to weaken. Other players are following your example, refusing to participate in the final scenarios. The forum you posted on has been spreading your message. I felt a strange mix of pride and terror. Good. David, you don't understand. The entity has been controlling probability for centuries. If it dies suddenly, all that manipulated causation has to go somewhere. Every person who should have died in a game scenario but didn't. Every impossible coincidence that saved a player's life. It's all going to snap back at once. What does that mean? It means reality is about to have a very violent seizure, and everyone who ever played the game is going to be at the center of it. I looked out my window toward downtown Portland, where Pioneer Square lay quiet under the streetlights. So what do you suggest? That I go claim my eternal power and help keep this cosmic horror show running? I suggest you make a choice. Either accept what you've become and help us manage the transition, or accept what's coming and hope you can survive it. The line went dead. I sat in my apartment for the next hour, thinking about choices and consequences, about survival and humanity, about the difference between winning and simply refusing to lose. At 11:59, I made my decision. Instead of going to Pioneer Square, I walked to my computer and began typing. If reality was about to break down, if all the game's players were about to face some kind of supernatural backlash, then people deserved to know what was coming and why. I wrote everything down: the true nature of the Century Challenge, the entity behind it, the way it fed on moral corruption, and the price of the eternal power it offered to winners. I posted it everywhere I could think of: Reddit, social media, obscure forums, anywhere someone might see it and understand what was happening. At exactly midnight, every light in Portland went out. The blackout lasted for 3 minutes and 17 seconds. When the power returned, the world had changed in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. Electronics worked differently. Smartphones occasionally displayed messages from unknown senders. Computers would show websites that didn't exist. Digital clocks would sometimes run backward for a few seconds before correcting themselves. It was as if the boundary between the supernatural and the technological had become permanently blurred. People reported strange dreams, moments of inexplicable intuition, brief glimpses of probability streams and causal threads. The game's influence hadn't disappeared. It had dispersed, spreading its reality-warping effects across the entire population instead of concentrating them in a few chosen players. Emma was right about the consequences. Every impossible coincidence the game had engineered to keep its players alive did snap back, but not in the way she'd predicted. Instead of causing mass destruction, the reversal created a kind of background chaos that made the world slightly more dangerous for everyone, but catastrophically lethal for no one. Car accidents increased by a small percentage. People slipped and fell more often. Electronics failed with slightly greater frequency, but the changes were gradual, distributed, manageable. Reality had absorbed the shock of the game's collapse by spreading it thin across billions of lives instead of concentrating it in a few dramatic disasters. As for the players themselves, we survived. Changed, certainly. Most of us retained some degree of the enhanced survival instincts and threat assessment abilities the game had taught us. But we remained human, capable of compassion and moral reasoning, able to choose empathy over optimization. The forum still exists, though it's evolved into something more like a support group for people learning to live with supernatural experiences. We help new members understand their abilities, share strategies for staying grounded in human values, and watch for signs that someone might be losing themselves to the calculating coldness the game tried to instill in all of us. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd made different choices, if I'd accepted the entity's offer of eternal power, if I'd become one of its agents, if I'd allowed myself to be completely corrupted by its influence. Would the game still be running, claiming new players, turning good people into willing monsters? But mostly, I don't think about it. The game is over, the entity is dead or dormant, and the world is a little stranger, but not significantly more dangerous than it was before. I survived 100 days, but more importantly, I survived them as myself. That's victory enough for anyone.